In a world ruled by fear and violence, one woman's defiance could tip the balance. A dangerous man, known only for his cruelty, and a woman with nothing left to lose. What happens when their paths cross? Listen closely, as this story takes you to the edge of survival, power, and betrayal. Welcome to a tale meant only for your ears. Tgun was not just feared, he was loathed. His name alone sent chills down the spines of men who thought they knew what it meant to be cruel. In the underworld, he was known as a monster, cold, unforgiving, and ruthless. But there was one thing that set him apart from the other criminals in his circle: his venomous hatred toward women. To Tgun, they were a weakness, a distraction, and he made sure to remind everyone that he had no need for them in his life. He ruled with a savage hand, brutalizing anyone who crossed him without a second thought. His cruelty wasn't reserved only for enemies. Even those within his ranks feared his unpredictable rage. Tgun's heart had long since turned to stone, and he reveled in his own mercilessness. It wasn't about power. It was about control over everything and everyone around him. There were stories told in whispers about the things he did, but none of those whispers came close to the truth. Tonight, he stood at the edge of a burning house, its flames licking the night sky. Tgun didn't flinch. He watched the fire consume everything with cold, detached eyes. To him, this wasn't personal. It was just business. The old man who owned the house had crossed him, and in Tgun's world, that meant only one outcome: total annihilation. His men stood by, awaiting his command. No one moved unless Tgun said so. He ruled through fear, and that fear was absolute. Burn it all. Tgun had said earlier that night, his voice like ice. Make sure nothing remains. But as the fire raged, someone ran towards the haze of heat and smoke. Someone who wasn't part of the plan. A woman, young but fierce, charged toward the house with a scream stuck in her throat. Her clothes were already signed from the heat as she tried to get closer, desperate to save what was already lost. That's her, one of his men muttered. The old man's niece. Tgun's gaze fixed on the woman as she fought to reach the flames, the fire reflecting in her eyes. She was frantic, her hands clawing at the air as if she could somehow drag her uncle back from the blaze. Stop her, Tgun ordered, his tone sharp, but there was no emotion behind it. One of his men grabbed her by the arm, pulling her back. She struggled, kicking and screaming, but she wasn't weak. Her strength surprised them, and when she managed to break free, she turned her fury on the man standing at the center of it all, Tgun. She stormed toward him, unafraid of the beast everyone else cowered before. "What kind of monster are you?" she spat, her voice trembling with rage and grief. Tgun stared at her, unmoved by her outburst. He had seen anger before. It didn't scare him. He took a step closer, towering over her, his presence alone enough to silence most people. But not her. She didn't back down. "Your uncle knew the price of betrayal," Tgun said coldly. "You should be grateful I'm letting you walk away." Tina's eyes blazed with hatred. She didn't care about the consequences. She didn't care who he was. At that moment, she hated him more than anything in the world. "I'll never forgive you for this," she hissed through clenched teeth. Tgun smirked, a cold, twisted smile that held no warmth. "Forgiveness? I don't need your forgiveness, girl. You're still alive because I allow it." Tina's challenge didn't sit well with Tgun. No one, man or woman, stood against him without consequences. The smirk he wore earlier faded as he considered her words, her defiance simmering in the air. His men watched, uneasy, knowing that Tgun never let disrespect slide. He signaled to one of his lieutenants with a flick of his hand. "Take her." Tina's eyes widened for a split second, but she quickly regained her composure. standing her ground even as two of his men approached her. "What are you doing?" she demanded, struggling as they grabbed her arms. "Let me go." Tgun stepped forward, his towering frame casting a shadow over her. His voice dropped to a cold whisper, just for her ears. "You think you can walk away after challenging me like that? No one talks to me the way you did and remains free." She spat at his feet, her voice shaking with fury. "You'll pay for this." Tgun laughed, a low, menacing sound. "We'll see who pays." With a swift nod, his men dragged Tina away. Her screams echoed into the night, her struggles growing weaker as they hauled her into the darkness. Tgun's eyes followed her, his expression as unreadable as stone. It wasn't about her now, it was about control. She had dared to stand up to him, and for that, she would pay. Tina's uncle wasn't an innocent man. He had once been loyal to Tgun's organization, working quietly in the shadows, handling the financial deals that kept the money flowing. But greed has a way of turning men foolish. He'd skimmed from the profits, hidden money where he thought Tgun would never find it. But in Tgun's world, nothing stayed hidden for long. The moment he discovered the betrayal, the punishment was swift. There were no second chances, no warnings. And tonight, that betrayal burned, literally. Tgun had ordered the house torched, not out of rage, but as a message. No one stole from him and lived to tell the tale. As Tina's continued to scream for help, Tgun's focus shifted briefly to the woman now being dragged away. She was nothing to him, a consequence of someone else's failure. Her grief, her anger, it meant nothing. In his mind, she was just a reminder that he was in control. Days passed before Tina opened her eyes to find herself in a cold, dark room, barely more than a cell. The walls were thick stone, and the only light came from a narrow slit high above, casting a faint glow over the sparse space. She was no longer in the life she knew. This was Tgun's mansion, and she was now his prisoner. He had locked her up without trial, without warning because he could. The guards outside her door made sure she didn't forget that. He had stripped her of her freedom, not out of interest or desire, but because he needed to show her, and anyone else who dared to challenge him, who held the power. Days turned into weeks, and Tina remained locked in her cell within the sprawling mansion. Her only company the flickering light that barely penetrated the darkness. The guards outside her door never spoke, and Tgun himself hadn't come to see her. The weight of silence pressed on her, but she refused to break. She wouldn't give him that satisfaction. Tina didn't know much about the man who now held her prisoner, but she knew enough. The stories she had heard about Tgun before her uncle's death were more than enough to paint him as a figure to be feared. Someone so ruthless that even the most hardened men quaked at the mention of his name. She knew she was dealing with a man beyond reason or remorse. And still, she wouldn't bow. If he thought locking her away in the shadows of his mansion would destroy her, he was wrong. Her resolve only grew stronger with each passing day. As for Tgun, Tina was barely a thought. His empire consumed him, always expanding, always finding new ways to dominate. He ran his operations with precision, knowing that one slip could mean the end of everything he had built. Tina was nothing more than collateral damage in a world full of betrayals and power plays. Her presence in his mansion was an afterthought. One evening, as Tgun returned from a meeting with his right-hand man, one of his lieutenants approached him in the dimly lit hallway. The man hesitated for a moment, as if weighing his next words carefully. "Boss, the girl, she's still holding up," the lieutenant finally said. "Hasn't broken yet." Tgun paused, his expression as hard as ever. "And?" The lieutenant shifted uncomfortably. "Nothing. Just thought you should know." Tgun's eyes narrowed. He had no patience for weakness, not even in conversation. "I didn't ask for an update. If she's alive, she's alive. If she dies, she dies." Keep her locked up." The lieutenant quickly nodded and retreated. There was no point in pushing further. Tgun had made it clear the girl didn't matter. That night, as Tina sat in the corner of her cell, she heard footsteps approaching for the first time in days. The heavy door creaked open, and a guard stepped in, tossing a plate of food onto the floor. Without a word, he left, the door slamming shut behind him. Tina stared at the plate, hunger gnawing at her insides, but she refused to eat. Not like this. Not under his terms. She was no fool. She knew this was part of the game. They wanted to see how far they could push her, how long it would take before she cracked. But she wouldn't give them that. As she stood to pace the small room, she caught the faintest sound of voices outside the door. One voice in particular made her blood run cold. It was him. Tgun. His presence, even just beyond the door, was enough to fill the space with dread. But he wasn't there for her. He was barking orders, planning something far bigger than the girl locked in the shadows. Tina listened, piecing together what she could. The words were few, but the tone was clear. Tgun was moving forward with something dangerous, something that would send shockwaves through his empire. And yet, here she was forgotten in the corner of it all. The cell door clanged open again, but this time, it wasn't just the usual guard with a tray of food. Two figures were roughly shoved inside. A man and a woman, both battered and bruised. They stumbled as they were thrown to the floor, the door slamming shut behind them. Tina's eyes widened as she quickly realized they weren't guards, and their haggard expressions told her they were victims just like her. The man groaned, pushing himself upright. His face was swollen from what looked like a recent beating, while the woman beside him clutched her side, barely able to stand. They both had the look of people who had been broken long before they were tossed into the cell. Tina watched silently as they collected themselves, her instincts telling her not to get too close. But curiosity won out. "Who are you?" she finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The man coughed, his voice hoarse. "We worked at his casino," he said, wiping the blood from his mouth. "He found out we were skimming off the top. Figured we'd make a little for ourselves." He gave a humorless laugh, shaking his head. Should have known better. Tina's heart sank. These were people who had dared to cross Tgun just like her uncle. And now they were here, awaiting the inevitable. The woman, whose face was pale and gaunt, met Tina's gaze. "We thought we could outsmart him. Everyone thinks that at first, but there's no escaping him. No mercy." There was a pause, a heavy silence hanging in the air. The man shifted closer, lowering his voice. "How long have you been in here?" Tina hesitated. "A few weeks. Maybe more. I don't know anymore." He gave her a sad look, nodding in understanding. "You're better off not knowing the time. Doesn't matter in the end." Tina swallowed hard, sensing the dread in their voices, the resignation that filled the air. These were people who had already given up, who knew what was coming. And for the first time since she was thrown into this cell, fear began to creep into her bones. She had managed to stay strong, to hold on to her defiance, but the reality of her situation was slowly tightening its grip. Hours passed with little conversation. Tina could feel the tension building, as if something terrible was coming, but no one spoke of it. Then, without warning, the door flew open again. Tgun's men stormed into the cell, grabbing the man and the woman with brutal efficiency. Tina shot to her feet, panic rising in her throat. "What are you doing?" The man struggled, but the guards were relentless, dragging him and the woman out of the cell and into the hallway. Tina pressed herself against the bars, watching in horror as they were forced to kneel. One of the guards glanced back at her, his expression cold. "This is what happens to people who betray Tgun," he said, his words biting and final. Before Tina could react, the gunshots echoed through the stone walls. The man and woman crumpled to the ground, their lives snuffed out in an instant. Blood pooled on the floor, a dark, spreading stain that seemed to fill the entire space with a suffocating sense of finality. Tina's breath caught in her throat, her hands trembling. For the first time, fear gripped her heart with an iron fist. She had seen death before, but never like this, so close, so brutal. She stared at the lifeless bodies, her mind racing. She had thought she could endure this, that her strength would carry her through. But now, faced with the reality of her own mortality, she felt that strength falter. Would she be next? Would Tgun order her death just as easily? Tina closed her eyes, taking a shaky breath. She couldn't afford to break down now. If she was going to survive, she had to prepare herself for whatever came next. She had to accept that death was a possibility, maybe even a certainty. But if that was her fate, she would face it with the same defiance she had held on to from the start. Even in fear, she wouldn't let Tgun win. The days after the execution of the 2 casino workers passed in a haze for Tina. The image of their lifeless bodies haunted her every moment, a constant reminder of what awaited her if Tgun decided to end her life just as mercilessly. Fear had settled deep inside her, gnawing at her resolve, but she kept it buried. She couldn't afford to let it consume her. She didn't know why Tgun hadn't ordered her death yet. Maybe it was a game to him. Maybe it was a power move, or maybe she simply wasn't important enough to warrant a quick execution. Whatever the reason, she was still alive, and that meant she had to stay alert. She had to find a way out of this nightmare, even if escape seemed impossible. The mansion was a fortress, and her cell was deep within its belly. Every time she heard the footsteps of the guards or the sound of the door creaking open, her heart raced, expecting the worst. But the worst never came, not yet at least. Each night, she found herself lying awake on the cold floor, her mind racing. She thought of her uncle, the life they had shared before it was all ripped away. The flames, the screams, and then nothing. Now, she was here, caught in the web of a man who barely acknowledged her existence, yet held her fate in his hands. Tina had heard stories about Tgun, but being at the mercy of his empire was a far cry from the whispered rumors she had once dismissed. He wasn't just ruthless, he was indifferent. That cold detachment terrified her more than any threats or violence. How do you fight against someone who doesn't care if you live or die? One evening, as Tina sat in the corner of her cell, the door opened again, but this time it wasn't to throw another prisoner into the room. One of Tgun's lieutenants entered, flanked by 2 guards. His expression was blank, businesslike, as he looked down at her. "Get up," he ordered. Tina's heart raced, but she complied, standing slowly, her body stiff from the long days of confinement. She tried to read his expression, but there was nothing, no hint of what was coming next. "You're coming with us," he said, motioning for the guards to lead her out of the cell. She followed them, her mind racing with questions. What was happening? Was this it? Was she finally going to meet her end? The hallway seemed to stretch forever as they led her through the mansion, the cold stone walls pressing in on all sides. Finally, they reached a set of stairs that led to the upper levels of the house. It was the first time Tina had seen anything beyond her cell since her imprisonment. The opulence of the mansion contrasted sharply with the grim reality of her captivity. Marble floors, chandeliers, and expensive artwork adorned the walls. This was the heart of Tgun's empire, his seat of power, and now she was being brought into it. They led her to a large room at the far end of the hallway, where Tgun stood by the window, his back turned to her. The city lights shimmered in the distance, casting an eerie glow over the room. He didn't acknowledge her presence at first. His attention focused on something far beyond the walls of the mansion. Tina's breath caught in her throat. She knew better than to speak. The guards flanked the door, silent and watchful, waiting for Tgun to make his move. After what felt like an eternity, Tgun finally turned to face her, his cold, dark eyes locking onto hers. There was no warmth in his gaze, no recognition of the fear or defiance that swirled within her. He looked at her as though she were an insect beneath his boot, insignificant, disposable. Without a word, he nodded to the man standing in front of his desk. The man stepped forward and handed Tgun a small stack of papers, documents of some sort. Tgun glanced at them briefly before tossing them onto the table nearby. "You're staying here," Tgun said, his voice as emotionless as ever. "For now." Tina didn't react. She had no idea what this meant, but she knew better than to ask. Tgun didn't elaborate. He simply turned back to the window, dismissing her presence as easily as he had acknowledged it. The guards took her away again, but this time, they didn't return her to the cell. Instead, she was led to a small room upstairs, still locked, still under guard. But it was no longer the dark, damp cell she had been in. It was almost a relief. Tina had barely settled into the new room when the door was locked behind her, the sound of the key turning in the lock echoing through the space. She glanced around, taking in her surroundings. The room was small but far from the dungeon she had been in. A simple bed, a table, and a single window overlooking the mansion's courtyard. The walls were bare, and though it was a far cry from her cell, it still felt like a prison. Tina sat on the edge of the bed, her mind racing. Why had Tgun moved her? What was his plan? She had no illusions that this was an act of mercy. There had to be a reason, but she couldn't figure it out. For now, all she could do was wait. The hours dragged on, and Tina's thoughts spiraled. She replayed the deaths of the casino workers over and over in her mind, the horror of that moment clinging to her like a second skin. She had accepted that her fate might be the same, but the uncertainty gnawed at her. Why was she still alive? The door creaked open again, and a tray of food was placed on the floor. This time, no guards spoke. They left her alone with her thoughts, the silence heavier than ever. In another part of the mansion, Tgun sat in his office, papers spread out before him, but his focus was elsewhere. He wasn't thinking of Tina. To him, she was still an afterthought, a lingering consequence of a betrayal that had already been dealt with. His empire was his true concern. He had enemies to crush, deals to close, and men to command. His cold efficiency was what kept him at the top, and he had no time for distractions. The girl, Tina, was simply a loose end he hadn't yet decided what to do with. If she proved useful, perhaps he'd keep her alive a little longer. If not, well, it wouldn't be the first time he had disposed of someone without a second thought. As he reviewed the latest financial reports from his casino operations with Idris, his right-hand man, there was a knock on the door. One of his lieutenants entered, bowing slightly before speaking. "Boss, we've secured the new shipment," the man said, his voice low. Tgun didn't look up. "Good. Make sure it's distributed quietly. No mistakes." The lieutenant nodded, understanding the weight of those words. Mistakes weren't tolerated under Tgun's rule. He turned to leave, but hesitated for a moment. "And the girl?" the lieutenant asked cautiously. Tgun's eyes flicked up, his gaze sharp. "What about her?" "She's still defiant. Not broken yet." Tgun's expression didn't change. "I told you before, she's not important. Let her be for now. If she becomes a problem, Idris will deal with her." The lieutenant nodded and left without another word, knowing better than to press further. Tgun returned to his work, the girl slipping from his mind once again. He had more important matters to attend to. The wheels of his empire kept turning, and he would crush anyone who stood in his way. Back in her room, Tina sat by the window, staring out at the courtyard. The moon hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the mansion grounds. She hadn't seen Tgun since the brief encounter in the large room, and part of her was glad. His presence chilled her to the bone, a reminder of the violence he was capable of. But even in her fear, Tina's defiance remained. She wouldn't let him break her, not like the others. She had seen what he did to those who betrayed him, and she knew what kind of man he was. But no matter how hard he tried, she wouldn't let him control her spirit. Still, there were moments, dark, quiet moments, when doubt crept in. The memory of the two casino workers haunted her, their last breaths replaying in her mind over and over. She had seen death before, but not like that. And she knew, deep down, that her time could come just as quickly, just as brutally. Tina took a deep breath, steeling herself. If she was going to survive, she had to be smart. She couldn't afford to be reckless. Not now. Not when Tgun held all the power. She would wait. She would watch. And when the time came, she would find her way out of this nightmare. For now, all she could do was survive. Tina had grown accustomed to the silence of her new room, a larger cage, but still a prison. The guards outside her door never spoke to her, never acknowledged her, as though she were invisible. Her days blurred together in a monotony of isolation, the minutes dragging on, filled with nothing but her thoughts and the faint sounds of life outside her door. Until one day, something changed. It started with a knock. Not the harsh rap of authority she had grown used to, but a gentle, almost hesitant tap. Tina froze, unsure of what to make of it. The door creaked open, and one of the guards stepped in, a man she had only seen in passing. His face was expressionless, but there was something different in his eyes, something softer than the cold, mechanical stares of the others. "You shouldn't be locked up like this," the guard said quietly, his voice barely more than a whisper. "No one deserves this." Tina blinked, momentarily thrown off guard by his words. She hadn't expected kindness from anyone in this place, least of all one of Tgun's men. I could let you out, just for a bit," the guard continued, glancing over his shoulder as if to make sure no one was watching. "I know you won't try to escape. Just stretch your legs. It's not right keeping you locked away." Tina stared at him, weighing her options. There was danger in trusting anyone here, especially someone tied to Tgun's brutal empire. But the offer was tempting. She hadn't been outside these four walls in what felt like an eternity. She nodded, her voice barely audible. "Just for a little while." The guard gave her a curt nod, unlocking the door and leading her cautiously down the corridor. He was careful, ensuring they avoided the other guards patrolling the mansion. For the first time since her captivity, Tina breathed in the fresh air of the courtyard. The night sky stretched above her, vast and comforting in its familiarity. For a brief moment, she almost felt human again. But it wasn't to last. Long before he learned of the guard's pity and of Tina's brief taste of freedom. It wasn't the act itself that enraged him. It was the disobedience. In Tgun's world, there was no room for compassion, no space for mercy. Those who crossed him, even in the smallest ways, would pay the price. That night, the guard who had shown Tina pity was dragged before Tgun. The man's face was pale, his fear palpable as he knelt in front of his boss. Tgun stared down at him with the same cold indifference he had for everyone who dared to step out of line. "You thought you could bend my rules?" Tgun's voice was low, dangerous. The guard's hands trembled. She's harmless, boss. She's just." Idra's hand shot out, silencing him with a backhanded slap across the face. The force of it knocked the guard to the ground, but he didn't dare rise. "You don't get to decide who's harmless," Tgun growled, his voice cold and devoid of emotion. "I make the rules here, and you've forgotten your place." Without another word, Tgun's men descended upon the guard, dragging him away into the shadows. His fate was sealed, and there would be no mercy. Tina had heard the commotion, but she didn't understand what had happened until the door to her room flew open. Two of Tgun's men stormed inside, their faces grim and unforgiving. Before she could react, they grabbed her by the arms and hauled her into the hallway, dragging her through the mansion like a prisoner being led to her execution. Her heart raced in her chest, fear pulsing through her veins. She had no idea what was happening, but the cold look in their eyes told her it wasn't good. They threw her at Tgun's feet. He stood there, looming over her like a god of wrath, his face as unreadable as ever. She could barely breathe under the weight of his gaze. "Do Do you think I didn't know? Tgun said, his voice deadly quiet. You had help? Tina's breath caught in her throat. So that's what this was about. The guard. He had shown her kindness, and now they both were paying the price. I don't care if you rot in this room, but you don't disobey me. Tgun continued, his eyes narrowing. You don't play games with my men? Tina glared up at him, hatred burning in her chest. I didn't ask for his help. Tgun's smirk was cold and dangerous. No, but you took it, and now you have blood in your hands. With a flick of his hand, the guard seized her once again, dragging her back to the room she thought she had escaped. This time, the door slammed harder, and the key turned with finality. Tina's heart pounded in her chest, rage mixing with the helplessness that flooded her. She had thought Tgun couldn't make her hate him any more than she already did, but now she was wrong. The guard's blood was on her hands, and Tgun's cruelty had etched itself deeper into her soul. She sat in the darkness, trembling with fury. Whatever fate awaited her now, she swore she would never let him win. One rainy night, Tgun had been returning to the mansion after finalizing a deal with some of his most dangerous associates when his convoy was hit. Bullets sprayed through the night, tearing through the armored vehicles with terrifying precision. Tgun and his men fought back fiercely, but the attack was calculated, planned by rivals who knew their weaknesses. In the chaos, Tgun was shot, a deep wound tearing through his side. His men, loyal as ever, quickly dragged him out of the line of fire and into the safety of one of the few remaining vehicles. But the damage was done. Tgun's vision blurred as the blood soaked through his shirt, his teeth clenched in pain. We need to get him back to the mansion, his right-hand man, Idris, shouted over the commotion. Now! The car sped through the streets, leaving the scene of the ambush behind. When they finally reached the mansion, Tgun was barely conscious, his breath shallow and his face pale from the loss of blood. Idris and the others hurriedly carried him inside, laying him down on a table as one of the guards rushed to call the standby doctors. But time was slipping away. From her room, Tina heard the commotion. The sudden noise, the frantic voices outside, and the unmistakable tension in the air signaled that something had gone terribly wrong. She pressed her ear against the door, trying to make sense of it. What's happening? She asked the guard stationed outside. The guard hesitated before answering. Tgun, he's been injured. Tina's heart raced, though she wasn't sure why. Part of her felt satisfaction at the thought of him finally facing consequences, but another part of her, a part she couldn't quite explain, was curious. Then, without thinking, she spoke up. I can help, she said, surprising even herself. I know some local treatments. If the doctors aren't here yet, I might be able to keep him stable. The guard looked at her, skeptical. You? Why would he trust you? He doesn't have to trust me, Tina replied, her voice steady. But if the doctors take too long, he could die. Do you want that on your hands? Moments later, Idris entered the room, his face tight with worry. The doctors are still a while out, he muttered, looking at Tgun, whose breathing was shallow and labored. He's losing too much blood. Tina stood nearby, having been brought in by the guard. She could see the severity of the wound, the way his body was weakening. I can treat him, she said, her voice firmer now. But you need to let me. Idris stared at her, for a moment torn. Tgun, the man who commanded respect and fear from everyone around him, now lay helpless before them. He won't let you touch him, Idris said, his tone filled with doubt. He'll never. But there was no time to argue. If you don't let me try, he's going to die, Tina pressed. Do you want to lose him because of pride? Idris clenched his fists, clearly struggling with the decision. Finally, he looked down at Tgun, who barely managed to open his eyes. Boss, you need to let her help, Idris said softly, pleading with the man he'd followed for years. The doctors aren't coming fast enough. Tgun's gaze flickered toward Tina, a mix of pain and defiance still lingering in his eyes. Even now, he hated the idea of letting her near him. But his body was failing, and there was no other choice. Fine, Tgun gritted out, his voice weak but full of contempt. Do it. Tina wasted no time. She gathered what little supplies she had, improvising with cloth and herbs she had learned to use for wounds back when her uncle was still alive. Her hands moved swiftly, but inside, she was a whirlwind of emotions. Here she was, helping the man who had destroyed her life, whose cruelty knew no bounds. As she pressed the cloth against his wound, Tgun winced, his body tensing under her touch. He hated every second of this. Hated that he needed her help, hated that she was the one keeping him alive. But there was no denying it. Without her, he might not make it. Tina focused, refusing to let her emotions cloud her judgment. She could feel his eyes on her, watching her every move, but she didn't flinch. For now, their mutual hatred was secondary. Survival was the only thing that mattered. Idris hovered nearby, his worry evident as he watched Tina work. He had never seen anyone stand so close to Tgun without cowering, let alone touch him. It was strange, but there was no denying the way she moved with certainty, her hands steady as she cleaned and treated the wound. The minutes stretched into what felt like hours, but eventually, the bleeding slowed. Tgun's breathing evened out, though his face was still pale. Tina stepped back, her hands covered in blood, her chest heaving with the weight of what she had just done. When it was over, the room was thick with silence. Tgun's eyes fluttered closed as exhaustion overtook him, but not before they flicked back toward Tina, a silent acknowledgement of what had just transpired. Idris glanced at her, a mixture of relief and gratitude on his face. "You saved him," he said quietly, though his tone held a weight of caution. "But don't think this changes anything." Tina met his gaze, her expression hard. "I didn't do it for him." She turned to leave the room, her heart pounding. The line between them had shifted, but she didn't know what it meant yet. She had saved his life, but the power dynamics remained unclear. Tgun was still the man who had taken everything from her, and now he owed her something, though she doubted he'd ever acknowledge it. Tina lay on her bed that night, unable to sleep. Her mind raced, replaying the events over and over again. The ambush, Tgun's injury, and her role in saving him. She had never expected to find herself in such a position, tending to the wounds of the man who had taken everything from her. Yet, here she was, tangled in a web of emotions she couldn't fully untangle. Part of her hated that she had helped him. It felt like a betrayal of her own suffering. But another part, a quieter part, knew she couldn't have let him die. Not like that. Perhaps it was her compassion, or maybe it was just the reality of the moment, but it gnawed at her nonetheless. The next morning, as Tina paced her room, the door opened unexpectedly. Idris entered, his expression unreadable. "Tgun wants to see you," he said, his voice firm, but lacking the usual hostility. Tina felt her pulse quicken. She wasn't sure what to expect. Had he changed his mind? Was this some form of twisted repayment? She followed Idris through the halls, her heart heavy with uncertainty. When she entered Tgun's private quarters, the air felt heavy. He sat in a chair by the window, the bandages still wrapped tightly around his torso. His face, pale from the loss of blood, was as hard and cold as ever. His eyes flicked toward her, but there was no gratitude in his gaze. Only the same indifference she had come to expect from him. For a moment, they just stared at each other, the silence thick between them. It was as if the room itself held its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. "You saved my life," Tgun finally said, his voice low and measured. There was no question in his statement, just a cold acknowledgement of the facts. Tina didn't respond. She didn't know what to say, nor did she feel the need to justify her actions. The truth was clear to both of them. She had saved him, but that didn't change anything. Tgun's gaze darkened, and he leaned forward slightly, wincing at the movement. Why? It was the first time he had asked her something so direct, and the question hung in the air like a challenge. Tina hesitated for a moment, then straightened her back, meeting his cold stare. "I didn't do it for you," she said, her voice steady. "I did it because I could. You were dying, and I wasn't going to let you die like that." Tgun's eyes narrowed, studying her with the same calculating gaze he always wore. There was no softness in his expression, no trace of vulnerability, despite the fact that she had just saved him from death. He didn't trust her. He never would. But something had shifted between them, something that couldn't be ignored. After leaving his quarters, Tina returned to her room, her thoughts more conflicted than ever. She had expected his reaction, the cold indifference that had become a hallmark of their interactions. But the fact that he had asked why unsettled her. Why did he care? Why did it matter to him that she had saved his life? It didn't make sense. That night, Tgun too was restless. His body ached from the wound, but it was something else that kept him awake. He couldn't shake the memory of Tina's hands as they worked to save his life. The steadiness of her movements, the focus in her eyes. She had done it without hesitation, despite everything. It made no sense to him. Tgun had always lived by a simple rule. Power and control were everything. Compassion was a weakness, and he had no use for it. And yet, he couldn't deny the fact that she had saved him. It bothered him more than he cared to admit. He told himself it was nothing. A fluke, an act of survival, not kindness. But even as he tried to dismiss it, the memory clung to him, refusing to be ignored. His right-hand man, Idris, entered the room, interrupting his thoughts. "Boss, you need rest." "The doctors said." "I don't need doctors." Tgun snapped, his voice sharp. "I'm fine." Idris nodded, though his expression betrayed his concern. He hesitated before speaking again. "The girl, Tina, she..." "Enough," Tgun interrupted. "I don't want to hear about her." Tina's days in the mansion passed with a quiet monotony, but something had shifted after she saved Tgun's life. Though he hadn't shown her any warmth or gratitude, the atmosphere felt different, more charged with an undercurrent she couldn't quite name. And then there was Idris. He had always been the shadow beside Tgun, his right-hand man, loyal and deadly. But recently, Idris had begun to visit Tina's room more frequently. At first, he stood silently, making sure she wasn't causing any trouble. But as the days passed, his visits turned into short conversations, small, cautious exchanges that felt almost friendly. Tina had been surprised. Idris wasn't like Tgun. He didn't carry the same cold detachment, though there was still an air of careful distance about him. When he spoke to her, there was no cruelty, just a sense of obligation, as though he was trying to balance his duty to Tgun with his own growing curiosity about her. "Do you ever get tired of this place?" Tina had asked one day, sitting on the edge of her bed as Idris leaned against the wall. He chuckled softly, a rare sound in the cold halls of the mansion. "More than you know," he admitted, his eyes distant for a moment. "But loyalty binds us in ways that aren't always easy to understand." Tina sensed the weight of those words. There was something unspoken between them, a recognition that they both understood their places in this twisted world. But while Idris seemed resigned to his role, Tina's defiance still burned brightly. "You're different from him," she said quietly, her gaze steady on Idris. "You're not like Tgun." Idris stiffened at the comparison, but there was no anger in his eyes. Instead, he gave her a small, sad smile. "Tgun and I have been through a lot together. I owe him my life." He paused, his voice softening. "That's something you can't just walk away from." As the days passed, Idris's visits became a welcome distraction from the oppressive loneliness of Tina's confinement. He never crossed any boundaries, but there was a growing sense of camaraderie between them, an understanding that set him apart from the harsh, brutal world Tgun controlled. One afternoon, Idris returned to Tina's room with a thoughtful expression on his face. "You've been wearing that same thing since we brought you here," he said, glancing at her worn and tattered clothes. "It's not right." Tina shrugged, her voice laced with bitterness. "What does it matter? I'm just a prisoner." Idris shook his head. Even prisoners deserve some dignity. Later that day, Idris approached Tgun. The conversation was brief, but its weight was clear. "Tina's been wearing that ragged dress since the day we brought her in," Idris said, his tone casual but with a hint of something deeper. "I think it's time she had something else to wear." Tgun, sitting in his chair with his usual air of indifference, barely looked up from his work. What difference does it make? He muttered. Idris hesitated for a moment. It's a small thing, but he stopped, choosing his words carefully. It might change something. To his surprise, Tgun's response was unusually dismissive. Do whatever you like. Idris blinked. He had expected resistance, maybe even a sharp refusal. But Tgun's indifference was unsettling. He had known Tgun for years, and this wasn't like him. Was it the wound? Or something else? Regardless, Idris nodded and left the room, his mind still turning over Tgun's unexpected reaction. When Idris returned to Tina's room the next day, he brought with him a new dress. Simple, but far more dignified than the ragged clothes she had been wearing. He handed it to her without much ceremony, though there was a small smile playing at the corner of his lips. Here, he said, his voice softer than usual. You deserve better than what you've been given. Tina stared at the dress in surprise, her fingers brushing over the fabric. It was strange, this act of kindness in a place where cruelty ruled. For a moment, she didn't know how to respond. Thank you, she said quietly, her voice almost lost in the silence between them. Idris nodded, though there was a flicker of something in his eyes, something deeper. Don't mention it, he replied, but there was a hesitation in his words, as if he wanted to say more but couldn't. Tina's new dress felt strange against her skin, soft and unfamiliar after weeks of wearing the tattered rag she had been arrested in. When she looked in the mirror, she hardly recognized herself. The woman staring back at her seemed like a ghost of who she had been before all of this. She didn't know whether to be grateful or angry for Idris's kindness, but a part of her couldn't ignore the fact that it had changed something between them. Idris continued his visits, and their conversations deepened. There was a warmth in his presence, something steady that grounded Tina in a place that felt so disconnected from the real world. He would bring her small things, sometimes a book, sometimes fresh food from the kitchen, little gestures that seemed so out of place in the cold, cruel mansion. Yet, despite the comfort his presence brought, Tina never forgot the reality of the situation. Idris was loyal to Tgun, and she could never forget what that meant. No matter how friendly he seemed, he was still the right hand of the man who had imprisoned her, the man whose cruelty had shaped her entire existence since that fateful night. As the days passed, the dynamic between Tina and Idris grew more. They spoke more often, shared more moments of quiet conversation, and in those moments, Tina began to feel relaxed. There was a connection between them now, a subtle but undeniable pull. He saw her in the new dress, a small part of him felt proud. It was a simple thing, but it made a difference. She looked more like herself, more like the woman she had been before Tgun's world had torn hers apart. You look better, he said softly during one of his visits, his eyes lingering on her for a moment longer than usual. Tina smiled, a small, tentative thing. Thank you for everything. Their eyes met, and for a brief moment, the room felt smaller, the air thicker. Neither of them spoke, but there was something unspoken between them, a connection they both felt. Tgun had never been one to miss details. He had noticed the subtle changes, the way Idris's visits had become more frequent, the way Tina seemed to carry herself differently now that she wasn't confined to rags. He didn't say anything, but he observed, as he always did, letting the information settle in the back of his mind. It wasn't jealousy, he told himself. Jealousy wasn't something he had the luxury to feel. Tina was a prisoner, a consequence of her uncle's betrayal. That was all she had ever been. Idris's growing attachment to her was interesting, but ultimately insignificant. Idris was loyal. Tgun knew that better than anyone. And yet, there were moments when Tgun found himself thinking about it more than he should. He hadn't allowed himself to acknowledge it before, but there was something about Tina that lingered in his thoughts, even when he tried to push it away. It wasn't a desire. He had never cared about such things. But the fact that she had saved his life, that she had been in the position to do so and had chosen not to let him die. It complicated things. The connection between Idris and Tina was becoming more visible, and Tgun couldn't help but notice the way she looked at Idris, how her guard lowered slightly in his presence. That was something Tgun had never seen from her. She had always been defiant, distant, with walls built so high he couldn't see over them. But with Idris, those walls were starting to crack. Tgun's eyes narrowed as he observed Idris walking down the hall, fresh from yet another visit to Tina's room. It hadn't gone unnoticed, the growing connection between his right-hand man and the girl he had kept prisoner. Tgun's instinct was sharp. He saw everything, even if he chose not to act immediately. But today, he decided it was time to address the matter. Later that evening, as Idris approached him to deliver his usual report on the day's affairs, Tgun didn't waste time with pleasantries. "You've been spending too much time with her," Tgun said coldly, his voice low but laced with warning. Idris stiffened, but he didn't look away. He had known Tgun long enough to recognize that tone. "With all due respect, boss, she saved your life," he replied, his voice measured but firm. "She deserves at least that much." Tgun's expression didn't change, but there was a flicker of something, perhaps irritation or maybe something deeper. "I didn't ask her to save me." "No, but she did," Idris shot back, his loyalty to Tgun still evident but tempered by his own sense of honor. "I know you don't care about most people, and maybe you don't care about her, but I also know you're not ungrateful." The room fell in a silence for a moment, the tension palpable. Tgun didn't respond, his jaw tightening as he considered Idris's words. He wasn't used to being reminded of debts, especially not ones tied to a woman like Tina. But Idris was right. There was an unspoken debt between him and the girl. He couldn't ignore that, even if he wanted to. Still, the conversation left a bitter taste in his mouth. He didn't like the growing connection between them, even if he told himself it didn't matter. Days passed without incident, but when the time came for Tgun to attend an important Empire meeting, one where appearances mattered more than anything, an unexpected problem arose. The woman who had been arranged to accompany him fell ill, leaving Tgun without the usual cover of elegance and formality that was expected at such gatherings. "Find someone else," Tgun growled at Idris, pacing the floor of his office. Idris hesitated. "There's no time," he replied, his voice calm but insistent. "Security checks, arranging someone new. It's too late." Tgun glared at Idris. He could read his expression, his frustration mounting. "I'm not going with her," he spat, the disdain for the idea clear in his voice. The thought of being seen with Tina, of parading her in front of his associates, was unthinkable. But Idris wasn't easily deterred. Tina's already here, under this roof, where she's safe and can't be used by our enemies. Security-wise, she's the best option we have. Tgun's fists clenched at his sides. The practicality of Idris's suggestion was undeniable, but it gnawed at him. The idea of Tina being his companion at such an event felt wrong in ways he couldn't explain. Yet, he had no other choice. "Fine," Tgun muttered darkly, "but make sure she's presentable." Idris nodded, quickly leaving to make the necessary arrangements, while Tgun stood there, brooding over the situation. The thought of being seen with Tina in public, of presenting her as something more than a prisoner, unsettled him in ways he hadn't anticipated. Later that evening, Tina stood in front of the mirror in a room she had never seen before, dressed in a gown that Idris had personally selected for her. The fabric clung to her in ways that made her feel exposed, but it was undeniably elegant, far removed from the rags she had worn for so long. Her hair, usually tied back and forgotten, had been carefully styled, and for the first time since her imprisonment, Tina saw a version of herself that reminded her of the life she had before Tgun came crashing into it. When Idris entered the room, his breath caught in his throat. She looked different. He had always known Tina was strong, But tonight, there was something more, a grace, a resilience that shone through despite everything she had been through. "You look," Idris trailed off, struggling for the right words. "You look perfect." Tina gave him a small, uncertain smile. "I feel like I'm wearing someone else's skin." Idris chuckled softly. "You'll be fine. Just be yourself. And don't let him get to you." Tina nodded, her heart racing. She had no idea what to expect from the evening, but there was a sense of dread coiling inside her. When Tina stepped into the main hall where Tgun was waiting, the air seemed to shift. His eyes fell on her, and for a moment, he couldn't hide his reaction. She looked different. The woman standing before him was nothing like the defiant prisoner he had kept locked away. The dress, the way her hair framed her face. She looked like she belonged in this world of power and control, and yet it unsettled him. But Tgun quickly masked his reaction, his expression hardening as he approached her. "You look decent," he muttered, though the words felt weak even to his own ears. Tina didn't respond, but there was a glint of defiance in her eyes that hadn't faded. Even now, dressed in finery, she wouldn't submit to him. As they arrived at the Empire meeting, the atmosphere was heavy with expectation. Tgun moved through the room with his usual air of authority, but there was an unusual edge to him tonight. His eyes flicked constantly to Tina, who was now the subject of curious glances and hushed whispers among his associates. Tina walked beside him, her head held high, but she could feel the weight of the room pressing down on her. She didn't belong here. She never would. And yet, for some reason, being at Tgun's side made her feel as though she was walking into battle. Throughout the evening, Tgun found himself growing increasingly possessive. He didn't understand it. Tina was supposed to be nothing to him. Yet the way the others looked at her, the way their eyes lingered on her, he hated it. More than once, he placed a hand on her arm, guiding her through the crowd with an authority that felt uncharacteristically territorial. And Tina noticed. She felt the tension radiating from him. The way his hand gripped her arm a little too tightly, the way his gaze flickered with something she couldn't quite name. It was as though he couldn't stand the idea of anyone else looking at her, of anyone else thinking she was anything more than his prisoner. The evening had been tense, filled with whispered conversations and carefully measured glances. Tina moved through the room like a shadow at Tgun's side, her presence drawing curious stares from those who didn't know her story. But as the night wore on, a strange discomfort settled in her chest, a feeling she couldn't shake. The weight of Tgun's possessive hand on her arm, the way his eyes lingered on her. Everything felt off, and then chaos erupted. A loud crash shattered the fragile tension of the evening, followed by the unmistakable sound of gunfire. Tina's heart stopped, her eyes wide as panic spread through the crowd like wildfire. Men shouted orders, tables were overturned, and the polished elegance of the Empire meeting was suddenly replaced by raw violence. Tina barely had time to react before she was pulled forcefully to the ground. Tgun's grip on her arm tightened as he dragged her behind one of the large tables, his movements quick and precise. The deadly calm in his eyes was unlike anything she had ever seen before. For the first time, she saw Tgun in his element. Not the cold, distant man she had grown used to, but a warrior, ruthless and unflinching. He moved with deadly efficiency, his gun already in hand as he fired off precise shots into the chaos. His every movement was calculated, like a predator hunting its prey. Tina's breath hitched as she watched him in action. There was something terrifying about the way he moved, the way he didn't hesitate to pull the trigger, ending lives with chilling ease. He seemed to anticipate every threat before it appeared, his body flowing through the room in a deadly pattern she couldn't comprehend. Her hands trembled as she crouched behind the table, her mind reeling from the shock of the sudden violence. The man she had spent weeks hating. The man who had kept her locked in a cage. Now he was fighting to protect her. And for the first time, Tina felt something other than anger toward him. She felt fear. Not fear for her life, but fear of him. As the gunfire intensified, Tgun's focus never wavered. He took down each attacker with the same cold precision that had built his empire. The meeting had been targeted by one of his competitors, a power move designed to send a message. But if they thought they could break Tgun, they had made a deadly mistake. Tina watched in awe and horror as Tgun dispatched one attacker after another, his movements fluid and deadly. She had known he was dangerous, but seeing him like this, fully unleashed, made her realize just how deep that danger ran. This was the man who ruled an empire of blood and fear, and now she understood why. A sudden explosion rocked the building, sending shards of glass raining down around them. Tgun didn't flinch. He grabbed Tina's hand, pulling her behind him as he pushed through the chaos, firing off shots to clear their path. "Stay close," he growled, his voice rough with adrenaline. Tina nodded, her heart pounding as she followed him, barely able to keep up. The air was thick with smoke and the acrid smell of gunpowder. Bodies lay scattered across the floor, but Tgun moved with deadly focus, his only priority getting them to safety. They finally reached a narrow hallway at the back of the building, far from the chaos still raging in the main room. Tgun pushed Tina into the shadows, positioning himself between her and any potential threat. His chest heaved with exertion, his eyes scanning the hallway for any remaining danger. For a moment, everything was still. It was the safest option. The gunfire had faded into the background, replaced by the distant sounds of sirens. Tina's entire body was shaking, her mind still reeling from what she had just witnessed. She stared at Tgun, her heart in her throat. And then, without warning, Tgun turned toward her, his expression unreadable. Before she could process what was happening, he pulled her into a tight embrace. Tina froze, her mind racing. It was the last thing she had expected. Tgun, the man who never showed emotion, holding her close as if she were something precious. His arms wrapped around her, strong and protective, and for a moment, the world outside seemed to disappear. Neither of them spoke, both equally stunned by the sudden intimacy of the moment. Tgun's grip tightened for a brief second, as if he were grounding himself in her presence, before he quickly pulled away, his expression hardening once again. The moment passed as quickly as it had come, leaving both of them shaken. Tgun's jaw clenched, his usual mask of cold indifference slipping back into place. "Let's go," he muttered, his voice rough, as he turned and led her down the hallway, away from the carnage. Tina followed, her mind spinning with confusion. She didn't know what to make of the hug, or the man she had just seen in battle. So deadly, so efficient, and yet so human in that brief, unexpected moment. But one thing was clear. Something had shifted between them, and neither of them knew what it meant. The night's chaos still lingered in the air as Tgun's men arrived to extract him and Tina from the scene. The attack had shaken the entire gathering, but Tgun remained stoic, his face hard as stone. As his men escorted them out of the building, his gaze flickered briefly to Tina, who was still visibly shaken from the night's events. Her eyes were wide, her body trembling slightly, though she did her best to hide it. As soon as they reached the safety of the armored cars, Tgun's cold demeanor snapped. "This was a mistake," he growled, his eyes blazing with anger as he turned toward Idris. "You put her in danger. You put me in danger." Idris blinked, stunned by Tgun's outburst. "Boss, I thought." "You thought?" Tgun cut him off sharply, his voice low and dangerous. "She had no training. She could have been killed. We both could have." Idris stood silently, his surprise slowly giving way to a deep sense of guilt. He had thought that bringing Tina along would be practical, a way to keep Tgun safe while letting her experience the outside world, if only for a brief moment. But the night had spiraled out of control, and now Tina had been caught in the middle of something far more dangerous than either of them had anticipated. Tina, sitting quietly in the back of the car, flinched at the sound of Tgun's raised voice, though she didn't say anything. The fear from the night still clung to her like a second skin, and though she tried to keep her composure, she couldn't shake the images of Tgun firing his gun, the chaos that had erupted around them, and the bodies that had fallen. When they returned to the mansion, Tgun disappeared into his study without another word, leaving Idris to handle the fallout. As soon as Tgun was out of sight, Idris turned his attention to Tina, his heart heavy with guilt. She had been through so much already, and tonight had pushed her even further. Idris hesitated for a moment outside her room, unsure of what to say. Finally, he knocked gently and entered, finding Tina sitting on the edge of her bed, still pale from the shock of the night's events. "I'm sorry," Idris said softly, his voice filled with regret. "I shouldn't have let you go with him. I thought it would be good for you to see the outside world again, even if it was just for a moment." Tina looked up at him, her eyes tired but understanding. "It's okay," she replied, her voice quiet but steady. "I don't hold any grudges against you. You were just trying to help." Idris nodded, though the guilt still weighed heavily on his shoulders. He had seen the way Tgun had snapped at him earlier, and though it wasn't unusual for Tgun to lash out, there had been something different about his anger this time, something personal. He moved closer to Tina, his expression softening. "You should rest," he said gently. "It's been a long night." Tina gave him a small, grateful smile before lying down, pulling the covers up around her. Idris stood by her side for a moment longer, watching as her breathing slowed, the tension finally easing from her body as sleep overtook her. When he was sure she had drifted off, Idris quietly left the room, closing the door behind him with a heavy sigh. He couldn't shake the feeling that the night had changed things between him, Tina, and Tgun. Idris made his way to Tgun's study, bracing himself for another round of anger. When he entered, Tgun was seated at his desk, a glass of whiskey in his hand, his face partially hidden in the dim light of the room. He didn't look up as Idris approached, his gaze fixed on the papers scattered in front of him. For a moment, the silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken tension. Then unexpectedly, Tgun spoke. "Is she okay?" Idris blinked, taken aback by the question. Of all the things he had expected Tgun to say, this wasn't one of them. Tgun's cold demeanor rarely wavered, especially when it came to Tina. But now, there was something different in his voice, something that hinted at concern, though it was buried deep beneath his usual indifference. "She's fine," Idris replied, still unsure of how to respond. "Shaken, but she'll be okay." Tgun didn't say anything for a moment, his fingers tightening around the glass in his hand. His face remained impassive, but Idris could sense the tension simmering beneath the surface. Tgun had always been a master of control, but tonight had shaken him in more ways than one. Idris cleared his throat, unsure of how far he could push this unexpected moment. "Lost about earlier. I didn't mean to put either of you in danger. I thought it was the best option at the time." Tgun's gaze flicked up toward him, his eyes hard but unreadable. "It was a mistake," he said flatly. "Don't let it happen again." Idris nodded, understanding the gravity of the warning. But even as Tgun's cold demeanor returned, the fact that he had asked about Tina, had shown even a flicker of concern, stuck with him. Something was shifting, even if Tgun didn't want to admit it. As Idris left the study, his thoughts remained tangled. Tgun was changing, whether he realized it or not. And Tina, she was at the center of it all. The aftermath of the attack weighed heavily on Tina. She had been trying to hold herself together, but the more she replayed the events in her mind, the gunfire, Tgun's deadly efficiency, the cold embrace of death that had brushed so close, the more she withdrew into herself. Days passed, and she barely spoke. The fear, the uncertainty, the emotional weight of everything that had happened at the Empire meeting seemed to settle deep inside her, locking her away from everyone around her. It didn't take long for Idris to notice. At first, he thought she just needed time to process what had happened. But as the days turned into a week, his concern grew. She had stopped eating, barely touched the meals that were brought to her room. Each time he visited, she seemed more distant, her eyes hollow and lost. One afternoon, as Idris stood by Tgun's side, going over plans for a new shipment, he couldn't hide the tension in his face. Tgun, sharp as ever, noticed immediately. "What's bothering you?" Tgun asked, his voice clipped as he studied Idris. "You're distracted." Idris hesitated, knowing that bringing up Tina wasn't exactly what Tgun would want to hear. But he couldn't ignore it any longer. "It's Tina," Idris said finally, his voice low. "She hasn't been herself since the incident. She's not eating, not talking. I'm worried about her." Tgun's jaw tightened at the mention of her name. His instinct was to brush it off, to ignore the nagging concern that had been creeping into his mind since the night of the attack. "She'll be fine," he said coldly, turning back to the papers in front of him. "Let her be." But Idris could see that Tgun's words lacked conviction. He knew his boss better than anyone, and something had shifted since the attack, whether Tgun wanted to admit it or not. Later that evening, as Tgun sat alone in his study, the silence pressed down on him. He told himself that Idris was overreacting, that Tina would recover on her own in time. But the thought of her wasting away, trapped in her room, unsettled him in a way he didn't want to acknowledge. Before he could stop himself, Tgun called for the head chef. "Prepare something special," he ordered, his voice firm but lacking its usual edge. "And sent it to Tina's room." For a moment he paused, and finally said, "I'll take it myself." The chef didn't question him, though the request was strange. It wasn't like Tgun to personally deliver food, let alone to someone like Tina. But the order was followed, and soon, Tgun found himself standing outside her door, a tray of carefully prepared dishes in his hands. He hesitated for a moment, unsure why he was even doing this, but something pushed him forward. Tina was sitting by the window when Tgun entered, her gaze distant. She barely reacted as he placed a tray on the table in front of her. "Eat," he said simply, his tone clipped but softer than usual. "You need to regain your strength." Tina glanced at the food, but didn't move. Her mind was still swimming with the memories of the attack, the gunfire, the way Tgun had moved so effortlessly through the chaos, killing with such precision. She couldn't shake the image of his cold efficiency, and sitting across from him now, it all came rushing back. Her hands trembled as she reached for the utensils, but she couldn't do it. Everything felt too close, too raw. Without a word, she stood suddenly, pushing her chair back. Her heart pounded in her chest, and before Tgun could say anything, she turned and rushed out of the room, her emotions overwhelming her. Tgun sat frozen for a moment, staring at the empty seat where she had been. He had expected her resistance, her stubbornness, but not this. The disappointment that washed over him was unfamiliar, and for a brief moment, he didn't understand why he felt it. Without another word, he stood and left the room, the frustration and confusion tightening in his chest as he walked away from the uneaten meal. Later that night, Idris knocked softly on Tina's door. He had heard what happened earlier, and the guilt gnawed at him. He hadn't meant to push her into Tgun's world so quickly, hadn't realized how deeply the events of that night had affected her. When he entered the room, he found her sitting on the edge of her bed, her face buried in her hands. She was shaking, her breath coming in uneven gasps, and when she looked up at him, her eyes were red and filled with tears. "I can't do this anymore," Tina whispered, her voice cracking with exhaustion. I'm tired, Idris. I just want to leave. Please help me. The desperation in her voice hit Idris hard. He had never seen her so vulnerable, so broken. He wanted to help her, wanted to promise that he could get her out of this place. But the truth weighed heavily on him. I can't, Idris said quietly, sitting down beside her. It's out of my power. Tina let out a sob, her shoulders shaking as the weight of everything crashed down on her. Idris hesitated for a moment, then gently pulled her into a hug, holding her as she cried. He whispered words of comfort, though they felt empty against the enormity of what she was going through. I'm sorry, he murmured. I thought I was doing the right thing, letting you go with him. I thought you needed to see the world again. I didn't know it would turn out like this. Tina shook her head, her voice barely audible. It's not your fault. I don't know how much more I can take. Idris held her a little tighter, his heart heavy with guilt and helplessness. Neither of them noticed the door open quietly behind them. Tgun stood in the doorway, a tray of food in his hand, his face darkening as he took in the scene before him. Idris was holding Tina, her head resting against his chest, her tears still wet on her cheeks. For a moment, the air in the room felt charged, heavy with the weight of what Tgun was seeing. His chest tightened, his grip on the tray tightening as the unfamiliar surge of jealousy washed over him. Idris pulled away from Tina quickly, realizing too late that they weren't alone. His eyes widened as he met Tgun's gaze, understanding instantly what his boss must be thinking. Boss, it's not. Idris started, his voice full of urgency, but Tgun didn't wait to hear his explanation. With a cold expression, Tgun set the tray down on the table, his movements stiff and controlled. Without a word, he turned and walked out of the room, the door closing behind him with a decisive click. Tina, still trembling, looked up at Idris, confusion and fear swirling in her eyes. As Tgun's footsteps echoed through the dimly lit hallway, a weight settled in his chest, unfamiliar and unsettling. The image of Tina in Idris's arms burned in his mind, jealousy clawing at him in ways he had never anticipated. He had always prided himself on his control, over his empire, his men, his emotions. Yet now, he felt that grip slipping like sand through his fingers. For the first time, he found himself questioning everything. What happens when the very control that once defined him becomes a liability? In a world where emotions are a sign of weakness, the connection between Tina and Idris threatens to unravel his carefully constructed life. As the tension mounts and his heart races, Tgun stands on the precipice of a decision that could change everything. What will he choose when faced with this vulnerability? Stay tuned as the next chapter unfolds.